little bit about what anxiety patterns might look like at school, and some things that adults can do to support kids in reducing their anxiety. So, what we see is that a lot of times we have this cycle that occurs. So, there's a scary situation, and then either what happens is the anxious person avoids it, or an adult might come in and rescue them, which then reinforces them not interacting with that scary thing, might make them even feel better. And then in the future, they've learned, hey, avoidance or an adult coming and rescuing me is what I need in order to feel better. So I've got some examples on the next slide. So, for example, let's say you have a kid who is put in a scary situation of talking in front of class. They feel this increase in anxiety when that demand is put on them. And because of that, they refuse. They say, I'm not talking in front of the class. Because they don't do it, what does their anxiety do? It goes down immediately, right? Because they don't have to face that talking in front of the class. Um, and what have they learned? This accidentally got reinforced. So not talking in front of the class made them less anxious. And so that made me feel better. That's been reinforced now. You're going to see that behavior more in the future because they're going to avoid talking in front of the class next time. Next slide. So then same deal here, but this time I want to use the frame of what adults might accidentally do that could reinforce the anxiety. So this time, let's say it's a situation of talking to a new person. And for someone who's shy or anxious, that could increase your level of anxiety when you're being expected to talk to a new or unfamiliar person. What I've seen a lot of adults do is they then, so let's say I'm saying hi to a new kid. I say, hi, my name is Dr. Swails. What's your name? The kid's anxious, they're kind of hesitating, and then the adult swoops in. They say, oh, this is Alice. She's kind of shy. So what has that done? The adult has rescued the child from that anxiety-provoking situation. What does the child's anxiety do when their parent or adult speaks up for them? It immediately goes down. And then they've got reinforced this idea that the adult needed to talk for me. I can't do it. And they're going to avoid talking next time. Next slide. So we need to break this cycle. And one of the most effective ways to do treatment for anxiety is to do this idea of exposure. Exposure is the idea of practice makes perfect and trying to provide the right level of challenge to reduce someone's anxiety. So what these slides show is some examples of fear ladders, where what you try to do is figure out what is the anxiety about. So the one on the left, it's about social situations with peers. And the one on the right, I think it's about separation anxiety. And then they work with the kid to try to organize and figure out, okay, related to this concept of separation from parent or talking to peers, what's the least scary version of that? And it sounds like for the kid on the left, it was making eye contact with three people. I like how concrete that is. And then kind of arranging it up to more and more challenging, saying hi to friends, asking a friend a question, etc. So the way exposure would work is after you've helped kind of dive into the details of what's the least and most scary version of this, you'd start practicing. So, okay, making eye contact with three people, we're going to practice that every day until it doesn't seem so scary. And then after that, we'll start practicing saying hi to friends. So it's about practicing this gradually. For example, talking in front of the class, maybe it's at first that they're, instead of standing up in front of the classroom, perhaps they're sitting down in their desk, but still having to face some version of that fear. Um, Next slide. We also want to make sure when we're doing some of this anxiety practice that it's just the right level of difficulty. Just the same way of when we're providing academic learning, we want to provide just the right level of challenge in that zone of proximal development, right? And it's the same for anxiety too. If you ask someone to practice something on their exposure plan or their fear ladder that's too hard, that's called flooding, and we don't do that because nobody likes flooding. It's not a good idea. Next slide. So the question is, what can adults do when they're supporting kids as they're working through fear ladders? So the first and most important thing is praise that brave behavior. So whenever you see a child who is anxious and they face that fear, let's make sure we praise it and say, wow, that was really brave, or like, good job standing up in front of that class and talking. So make sure you're noticing and giving more attention to the brave behavior than you are giving to the anxious or avoidant behavior. We also want to reward coping behavior. So if you have a kid who's taking deep breaths to try to calm themselves down, we want to reward and praise that. Um, we can also encourage kids to use coping skills while they're in those anxiety-provoking situations, like deep breath or mindfulness or helpful thoughts, which we'll talk more about in a minute. And then importantly, you need to manage your own anxiety. So making sure that the adults are also modeling anxiety and calm rather than constantly saying, "Are you okay? Are you okay? Are you okay?" Which could then make them more anxious. Next slide. And then, it's all well and good to talk about kind of those really gradual, methodical fear ladders that I had before. But the other thing we can also think about is how do we live the exposure lifestyle? So, how do we find opportunities throughout the day in all experiences and for all kids in your classroom to approach what makes us nervous instead of avoiding it? So, I want you guys to think for yourselves, what opportunities could you see during the school day where someone could practice that exposure lifestyle, practice being brave? How might you see that at recess? How might you see that in class? When might you see that at school drop off? Even on holidays like Halloween. I had some really anxious kids from that too. And then, thinking about how can we make sure we're noticing and praising that brave behavior at those times. And then throughout the day, how do we model being calm? How do we praise behavior? How do we have a reward system for doing things that are uncomfortable? And then also making sure, like I said, more attention for brave behavior and less attention for anxious behavior. Next slide. There are some things that adults do that can make anxiety worse. So one of those is overprotection. So I think we've all seen times where a child might be kind of in this bubble, either from parents or also teachers, where we don't allow them to practice being in those anxiety-provoking situations, doesn't allow them to face their fears, and it also suggests to them that it would be dangerous if adults weren't swooping in to protect them. The other thing we might do is accidentally model anxiety. Um, I think most adults don't realize when they're doing this, but even noticing for yourself, talking about your stressors in front of kids. Are you modeling being like, yeah, I'm stressed about being late for work. However, I know it's going to be okay. So, how do we kind of model talking about our own anxiety in front of children? And then, of course, allowing avoidance or escape from anxiety provoking situations.